entertain points of order nor participate in debate.
Election of the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1062, the chair must be a member of the government party, and I'm ready to receive motions for the position of chair. Ms. Sahota. You're still on mute, Ms. Sahota.
I'd like to move Mr. Sven Spangelman as chair.
Okay, so it has been moved by Ms. Sahota that Mr. Spangelman be elected as chair of the committee. Are there any further motions? Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion? I declare the motion carried, and Mr. Spangelman is elected chair of the committee. And I will invite Mr. Spangelman to take the virtual chair.
Merci, Madame Lagreffière. Tout d'abord, à mes collègues de ce comité.
Thank you, and thanks to my colleagues for the confidence that you're putting in me. I'm very honored to be your chair, and I'm very eager to begin the work that we will be doing together. I'd like to welcome all of you, and if you're in agreement, we will now turn to the election of vice chairs. I apologize, Mr. Bergeron.
Intervention, and je nomine Monsieur Stéphane Bergeron.
I would like to nominate Mr. Stéphane Bergeron as vice chair of the committee.
And
Yes,
Mr. Chair, in view of the nomination of Mr. Bergeron, unless unless we are voting for 2 more vice chairs, I would withdraw my nomination.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Genuis, did you have a point of order?
Yeah, just a point of order that I'm being told that the staff who are on the phone line for the committee are having some real quality problems in terms of being able to hear what's going on, especially on the English feed, and they're having a hard time hearing. So I don't know if there's a way that can be resolved, but we want to make sure they're hearing. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Genuis. This is an important discussion. Let's turn it over to the clerk and then directly to the IT staff to see if that can be resolved in the next minute or so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are aware and we are working on it. And as soon as it is fixed, I will let you know.
Okay, we will.
Chair, perhaps before we move any further, I know we're going to have to wait and see whether people can actually hear the meeting, which is important. But I wonder if we could see whether there is a consensus amongst the committee to have three vice chairs. Perhaps we can hear from some of the other members of the other party to see whether that's the case.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Yes, and I have Mr. Brusen, who has raised her hand. And just before we go to Mr. Brusen, the participants field will show the people that have raised their hand. It also shows it chronologically, so please feel free to use that. I mean, we're still sort of in a setting where I can see everybody's hand. We will transition very likely into a hybrid format soon, so it's going to be more difficult to see people raising their hands. Please use the participants list and then the raise hand feature, which is the most transparent and also chronologically accurate way to measure that. I've got Ms. Hota. That was your previous hand raise, I would imagine, if you could lower your hand. And Mr. Brusen, please.
In fact, I was not going to speak to this point, so.
Oh, I have raised my hand again, Mr. Chair.
Okay, please, Ms. Hota, and then Mr. Diot.
Yeah, I was just going to speak to this issue of third vice chair. It did come up in the 43rd Parliament.
On a eu cette question pendant le 43e Parlement également.
I think there's an issue. I'm hearing my own English being interpreted into French right now. Okay, let's just make sure. No, I seem to be on the right language. Okay, well, I just wanted to say that, you know, this issue was tossed around at every committee the last session, and there was no real conclusion to this issue. It eventually went to Board of Internal Economy, and at that point, there was an issue in terms of how they would create this position so it didn't violate the Parliament of Canada Act in terms of pay, because it was said that the pay wasn't going to be increased in case there was more than one person that ended up with this position. Anyways, the issue became so complicated, and I don't know if there was ever a decision made by Boy on that. Is anyone aware if there was a decision made from Boy on that issue last session?
Okay, Mr. Brusen, thank you for putting the question to the room. Let's go with the list that we have, and I'm also advised that the phone line is working now, so staff are able to hear us. I have Mr. Diot, Mr. Oliphant, and Monsieur Bergeron next on the list.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is related. I'll leave it up to you whether we should discuss this now, but I've got a real concern that my Chief of Staff cannot join this meeting via Zoom. And I don't understand the concept of that, because she can be in my meeting in a real, if we were all in the same room. And I think that we all agree that we want to make this virtual session as close to a true parliamentary session as possible. So I'd like to get some answers on that and find out whether or not our main staffer could not join us in these committee meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Diot. We'll get clarification on that question. I have Mr. Oliphant, Monsieur Bergeron, and Mr. Harris.
Put this down. I was drinking coffee. Just with respect to the third vice chair position, my understanding is that there has not been consistency about this. Obviously, with Canada-China, we do have that, and it is a special committee, so there are different rules that apply to a special committee. My understanding is that the financial arrangements are such that there is compensation for the chair the first and second vice chair, but there would not be compensation available for a third vice chair. My concern is that we should have consistency among the standing committees on this. Again, Garnet will be surprised that I'm sounding like a fundamentalist, but it is such that I think that the standing orders are there, and I think they should be respected. My understanding is, it could be corrected, that the Board of Internal Economy did not add any more financial resources for a third vice chair. And I know that it's been brought up at a couple of committees, but not all of the committees. So I think that there's an inconsistency. That doesn't mean we don't want Mr. Harris's full participation all the time. However, I think that calling it a vice chair would be premature, in my personal opinion.
Mr. Oliphant, thank you. Let me quickly circle back to Mr. Diott's point. Mr. Diotte, I'm advised that the arrangement with respect to chiefs of staff or staff colleagues was made through the whips, and the primary constraint was one of technology, in the sense that it really puts an additional stress on the system at this point that may render it vulnerable. Surprising as that may seem, given that we have a large number of people joining in the House itself, but that is a constraint for the moment, and your point is certainly taken on board. If that changes, we will advise. I have Monsieur Bergeron, la parole est à vous, puis Monsieur Harris.
Three things, Mr. Chair. Have I understood correctly? I don't think we completed my nomination process. Am I in fact elected? Or because we turned to another question, a very legitimate question that was raised by Mr. Harris. So as far as the confirmation of my election as Vice President is concerned, I could say that I'd like to talk to that later, if I may. Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. I do understand you are in fact elected, but I'd like to confirm with the clerk. Should we be now discussing the potential election of Mr. Harris?
Monsieur Bergeron's election. So if you'd like to do that, you may.
Okay, Madam Chair, if prerogative of the chair to put the motion forward that Monsieur Bergeron be elected as vice chair of the committee.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Harris. You're on mute.
I don't want to preempt a ruling by yourself with the request of the chair, the clerk here, but there were two nominations, and what I said was that if we don't, if there's no agreement to have another chair, then I would withdraw my I guess turn down the nomination. But I don't think that was sort of conditional. I'm not trying to play games here. I just don't want to have an election now and say we're not going to talk about this anymore, because I do have something more to say about it. I will not stand in the way of Mr. Bergeron becoming the second vice chair, nor will I cause an election. But we did enter into this discussion, and I don't want to preempt having been cut off to have a final say, since I was on the speakers list, by a ruling that we don't know what it will be yet.
Mr. Harris, point understood and point taken. That was my comment to the clerk, that the discussion was continuing on a potential third vice presidency, but at a minimum, we would elect Monsieur Bergeron. I think that's the will of the committee. You have my commitment that you will come in and make your point after that.
Thank you. That being said, then I will I will ask that my name not be put forward for a position as vice chair in this particular election.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Are there any comments, any remarks, any opposition to Monsieur Bergeron being put forward as the vice chair of the committee? All in favor? Any opposed? Madam Clerk, I think we will declare Monsieur Bergeron as second vice chair of the committee. Félicitations, Monsieur Bergeron. And I will pass the word back to Mr. Harris.
Permettrez-vous de continuer, Monsieur le Président?
Can I say something, Mr. Chair? And after the floor will go to Mr. Harris. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all my colleagues. I'm sorry that Mr. Chong has been put in this delicate position with respect to Mr. Harris and myself. It's not the first time that Mr. Harris and I have found ourselves in this situation, because I will remind committee members that in the previous session, we did in fact decide as a committee to add a third vice chair position, and it was held by Mr. Harris. I do understand that there was an agreement during the previous parliamentary session, that being that there would be a third vice chair position for the NDP, and Mr. Chair, I would formally request that Mr. Harris become the third vice chair of the committee.
That we elect Mr. Harris as third vice president, and I had made a commitment to give the word back to Mr. Harris. Please go ahead, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bergeron, for your motion. I think the issue of pay seems to come up every now and then, but I will say to anyone, there's no effect on pay in this particular matter. Number one, I'm already a vice chair of the Canada-China Committee. There's no, there is a, you're vice chair of one committee. You can't be. There's no necessity or interest in any pay for a second situation like this. We have no interest whatsoever in making money an issue. It's an issue of your involvement in the committee as your party's recognized political party, and the role that you play in the chair and I think in the committee, both on the in terms of helping to set the agenda and being part of the committee on agenda and procedures, and you're representing your party. And I think the idea of being a vice chair is an important one from how you represent yourself to the public. And I think it's a good recognition. And we felt that it's been very useful in terms of developing policy and working with other people and working with stakeholders.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I think I have the order right. Mr. Oliphant next by physical waving of hand, and then Ms. Sahota, please.
I just wanted to check at what is the normal composition of the subcommittee on agenda. And maybe the clerk can help us with that. I know we haven't set our routine motions yet, but I think there is a convention around that. And just wanted to know how many and what is our representation on it.
Okay, Madam Clerk, would you like to intervene briefly on this point? I think it's in the routine motions, but it may be different in the routine motion that we passed last time than what the actual convention is.
Thank you. The routine motion passed last time. That the subcommittee on agenda and procedure contained 5 members, the chair and 1 member from each recognized party.
Okay, thank you, Madam.
If I could then just clarify then, what is the benefit of being a third vice chair? What are we really trying to decide on that? Because if the position is already at the subcommittee, I'm truly genuinely asking that question.
Mr. Oliphant, thank you. We'll leave that question hanging in the room for the moment and go to Ms. Sahota.
Yes, thank you. Of course, I understand what Mr. Harris is saying, that it could be, advantageous to have that position for many reasons. But I also would like to say that it's true that if you are still included in the subcommittee on the agenda, what happens by creating this position is really a logistical mess. And I understand that Mr. Harris is saying it's not about pay. But technically, it's not about pay, because according to the Parliament of Canada Act, they would have to pay anyone that is in the position of vice chair, whatever that extra bump is. So not doing so would go against the act, and the administration would not, they just couldn't do it. There was no exception made into the act that you could have a third vice chair and that one doesn't get paid. Right now, it would just be the position of a vice chair. So either there'd have to be legislation to brought in, or the act would have to be reformed. None of that is something that anyone wanted to seem to do in the last session. And so we're still in a position where if we were to vote in a third vice chair today, then you would put the administration in a position where they would have to abide by the act and have to give that wage increase. That is my understanding. So it does complicate matters, although the title and position may have some benefits. I think there's no real practical benefits in terms of what Mr. Oliphant has also said, that practically you'd still be able to participate and do everything that any of the other parties can, but having that title would complicate the matter of pay. So, you know, that's my my concern. That is that what you want to go forward with? I do think that perhaps we should maybe get an idea from our parties and perhaps maybe from PROC as well. I don't know, as to whether committees are going to move forward with this position, and how do we still deal with that element of extra pay.
Mr. Hoda, thank you very much. Just on a technical point, I've been asked to let you know that the sound quality still is posing a problem for interpretation. If there is a way for you to switch devices, that would be greatly appreciated. Monsieur Bergeron, la parole est à vous.
The floor is yours, Mr. Bergeron. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In all honesty, I can feel some people are uncomfortable about this debate. I would imagine that it would be relevant to talk about the composition on the Agenda and Procedure Committee. In the previous session, it's also relevant that we should ask ourselves these questions. Do we have a third post, a position? And if that's the case, and in a spirit of collaboration, I'm a little bit worried to see us start work, begin a debate on procedure, whether or not we should have Mr. Harris act as third vice president. If we want to really be cooperative and collaborative,
we were not able to continue our work at that time. And so if it's useful or relevant to ask ourselves what was the composition of the committee at the time, I believe that it would be just as relevant to ask ourselves now, ask ourselves whether or not there was a third vice chair, and there was. So I submitted a candidacy at this committee, and I believe that in the last session there was an agreement that the NPD could be a third vice chair in permanent committees, which was the case for ourselves, for our committee. So the clerk can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that this was the case for all standing committees. So I don't understand why this would be an issue now, given that this issue was solved in the last session in the spirit of collaboration. So I don't see why we would be still debating this issue, since we have solved the issue in the last session. So I would invite all committee members in the spirit of collaboration to give Mr. Harris to give him back his position as third vice chair of our committee, so that we can finally move forward and get working on real issues. That is what we will be working on as a committee in the coming weeks and months. So I would really like this technical issue to be solved quickly. I hope we do not continue to discuss the issue for much longer. And I wouldn't want that we start off our work as a committee on the wrong perception. I hope that we will be able to start our work based on a spirit of collaboration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Excusez-moi.
Sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Harris, Debruson, Sahota. Would our clerk like to weigh in on this issue now? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We did not have a third vice chair. The third vice chair position was only for the special committee on.
I can't hear.
Am I here now? Can you hear me? Okay. So Foreign Affairs and International Development did not have a third vice chair position in the previous session. It was only the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations that has that position, and that was done by motion from the House forming the special committee. The standing orders do not allow for a third vice chair. There was a report from the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs in the last session. That report was never concurred in. So currently, there is no mechanism by which standing committees can elect a third vice chair.
Madam Clerk, just before we go to the rest of the list, does that effectively render Mr. Bergeron's motion inadmissible?
I would suggest that yes, it would be an inadmissible motion as it is contrary to the standing orders.
Okay, I'd like to hear from Mr. Harris, Ms. Debruson, Ms. Sahota, please.
Well, the interesting discussion. I know that there was no final concurrence in the BOIE, but that doesn't mean that a committee can't make a decision, pass a motion, and let the BOIE and the House deal with it one way or the other. If it's the wish of this committee, the committee can elect a position of vice chair, and as was done in the past, and let them deal with it. I will assure you that this has nothing to do, and in fact, it might create a situation where the BOIE and the House may have to do something about it, because I have no intention, nor would I have anything to do with accepting any money for the position. And I think it could be an opportunity for the House to make a ruling on it, because we don't have. We have a minority parliament, and the spirit of cooperation in a minority parliament and recognition of the value that each party brought to this parliament, and the hope that we would all work together, was evident in the motion brought by the Conservative Party back in December. I think it was the first motion that was voted on in the House, the establishment of the Canada-China Committee, and I think that the precedent was established there. A very closely related committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, could play a good role in doing the same thing with respect to this committee, and it may bring about the change that's required. That's all I would have to say on it.
Mr. Harris, thank you. I have next on the list Madame Debruson, Madame Sahota, and Mr. Oliphant.
I was going to propose actually that we move to routine motions, given that we've just been told by the clerk that the motion that we're discussing is not in order. It looks like there's a larger issue that needs to be sorted out through the BOIE, be it however the right procedure is to figure it out. But we don't have standing to be able to appoint a third vice chair. So I think we should move forward, and I have a number of routine motions.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Harris?
Yeah, I've just been advised by our whip's office that, in fact, the PROC did report to the House on the third vice president, but the report was not concurred in by the House because the motion was not brought because of prorogation. So that's where the PROC is at the moment, and that's where they were before prorogation, and perhaps a decision by this committee or a motion by this committee would come back for consideration to the House that might be of use. So it's not a question that PROC did not come to a decision. They came to a decision, and they had a report to the House. That report was not. There was no motion for concurrence in the House before prorogation.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. That may actually be a helpful update. I'd like to hear the end of Ms. Debruson's intervention, and then Madame Sahota, Mr. Oliphant.
Well, in fact, Mr. Chair, I would like to proceed with motions to actually constitute our committee and the rules for our committee, because this motion can't, we've already been told that there is no standing for it. So if I may, I would like to begin with bringing routine motions beginning with analyst services, which is that the committee retain as needed and at the discretion of the chair the services of one or more analysts from the Library of Parliament to assist in its work.
I will seek the advice of the clerk. Madam Clerk, we have a motion on the floor that has not been disposed of. And now we have a second motion going to routine proceedings. If I could seek your assistance in the sequence in which we deal with this, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Right now, the information has been put before the committee regarding the third vice chair. It would be up to you to make a ruling on if that motion is admissible or not. And if it is inadmissible, then you are free to move on to other items.
I will, keeping in mind the conversation that's taking place and not wanting to foreclose arguments that need to be made, I will rule the motion inadmissible. I stand to be challenged on that if that's the case, and that may well be resolved at a later time. The points have been made thoughtfully and heard by all members. But Ms. Bruson has put a motion forward to do what really we are sent here to do today, which is to go through the routine motions to constitute our committee and to get us into the starting blocks. So I will rule the motion of Monsieur Bergeron inadmissible, stand to be challenged on that if that is the will of the committee, and then propose to move forward with the motion of Mr. Bruson to go into routine motions.
And so I had brought my motion on analysts.
Okay. Would you want to reread the motion just for clarity, Mr. Bruson, please?
Oui, je vais le lire en français parce...
I will read it in French as Mr. Bergeron has listened to a lot of English. So that the committee retain as needed and at the discretion of the chair the services of one or more analysts from the Library of Parliament to assist it in its work.
Debate on this motion. Seeing none, all in favor of the motion? Any opposed? Motion carries. And if I can just take the prerogative of the chair to intervene very briefly, Mr. Bruson, with my apologies. There are many other routine motions that we need to get through. But at this point, the committee is officially formed, and I would like to take a moment to welcome and to thank our hardworking and amazing House of Commons team, beginning with our clerk, Erica Pereira, and also our analysts, Nadia Fauché, Alison Goody, and Billy Joe BJ Sikierski. And I would like to give them the opportunity to say a few remarks to the committee should they choose to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start. I'm Erica Pereira. I've been a clerk here at the House of Commons for 14 years, and I will be your clerk for this session. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if we have our analysts on camera at the moment. If we do, yes, please, I see them. If any of them would like to say a few words to the committee, please, you're welcome to.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Alison Goody. I'm looking forward to working with you and all the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Fauché.
Bonjour.
Hello, I'm Nadia Fauché, and I will be very pleased to support the committee in its work this year. Once again, I am a part of Alison's team, the team of international affairs.
BJ Sikierski.
Yes, I'm BJ, and I apologize for not having a headset. I'm getting it next week. I
look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Equally like to thank our interpreters and our technicians, and we look forward to working with all of you over the weeks and months to come. And without further ado, I will pass the floor back to Madame de Bruson to continue through routine motions.
D'accord. Alors,
very well. So under a subcommittee on agenda and procedure, that the subcommittee on agenda and procedure be established and be composed of 5 members, namely the chair and 1 member from each recognized party, and that the subcommittee work in a spirit of collaboration.
debate on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Madam Clerk, as we do this, I'm just checking with you to make sure that that's an acceptable way of doing it. I think I have everybody in view. If there was opposition, it would be very easily identified. Thank you very much. Ms. DeBrusen, back to you.
Okay. Excuse me, Chair, just to clarify, I am pressing the raise hand and lower hand button. Would you rather I showed my hand?
At this point, I was looking at both. I didn't realize you were trying to come in. Please, Ms. Fry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask. I have been pressing the raise hand, lower hand button, but if you would rather us do it with a show of hands like this, let me know so I can do one thing or the other.
In debate where order was a bit more important, I prefer to go with the raised hand just to make sure I have the right sequence and the right order of chronology of intervention. During the voting, it's less important that it be done by raised hand. It could be just done by a show of hands because I literally have everybody in my view field at the moment.
Okay.
Mr. Bruson, please.
Okay. Meeting without a quorum, that the chair be authorized to hold the meetings to receive evidence and to have that evidence printed when a quorum is not present, provided that at least 4 members are present, including 1 member of the opposition, 1 member of the government, but when traveling outside the parliamentary precinct, that the meeting begin after 15 minutes regardless of members present.
Okay, members have heard the motion. Debate. I have Ms. Fry who has her hand up, and then Mr. Harris.
I'm sorry, I did not have my hand up. I lowered my hand in your participant box, and I didn't put my hand up. I thought you were asking for the vote, and I was going to vote yes. But that's okay. Sorry about that.
We're all good. Mr. Harris, please.
I would like to move an amendment to that there be 2 members of the opposition and 2 members of the government present for the hearing of evidence.
Okay, there's an amendment on the floor to the motion that Mr. Bruson just read on quorum. Any discussion on the amendment?
That's only to say further that that's been adopted in other committees this round.
Okay, seeing no debates, all in favor of the amendment? All opposed? Carried. The amendment carries. Back to the main motion. Any debate on the main motion?
As amended.
As amended, yes. Thank you. Seeing none, all in favor of the amended motion? Opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Bruson.
Okay, so now time for opening remarks and questioning of witnesses. That witnesses be given 10 minutes for their opening statement, and that at the discretion of the chair, during the first round of questioning of witnesses, there be allocated 6 minutes for the first questioner of each party as follows: Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Bloc Québécois, and New Democratic Party. For the second and subsequent rounds, the order and time for questioning be as follows: Conservative Party 5 minutes, Liberal Party 5 minutes, Conservative Party 5 minutes, Liberal Party 5 minutes, Bloc Québécois 2.5 minutes, New Democratic Party 2.5 minutes. And well, I understand that the opposition might have some amendments. Happy to listen to those if there are.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson. Debates. I see Mr. Harris.
I will defer to Mr. Bergeron first if he wishes to go before me.
Okay, Mr. Bergeron.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, je crois qu'il était d'usage dans le...
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think it was a routine in the previous session to ensure that the last 2 sequences be reversed so that during the second turn around that the Bloc would have 2.5 minutes and the NDP, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation when there's not enough time for the third round, and so that the NDP and the Bloc Québécois don't have enough time to speak. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Other comments?
If I may speak to that, Mr. Chair.
Please.
Yes, the motion would be to move the 2.5 minute rounds for the Bloc Québécois and the New Democratic Party to be after the first Conservative Party 5 minutes and Liberal Party 5 minutes. Then it would be Bloc 2.5 minutes, New Democratic Party 2.5 minutes, Conservative Party 5 minutes, and the Liberal Party 5 minutes. So that would be the second round. The first round would stay the same as 6 minutes apiece. And that's been done to ensure that the second round being only 2.5 minutes for the Bloc and the NDP, that they would not be cut off with that very short period of time, and that would be more equitably shared. There's a subsequent motion that may be made as well, potentially reducing the time of opening statements to make it more compatible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. It's incumbent on me then to time those 2.5 minute interventions quite precisely. I mean, there's a bit more latitude in a 5 minute intervention than there is in a 2.5 minute intervention. I will do my utmost to give credit to the will of the committee and to implement this proposal if it passes. Any other debate on this? Seeing none, all in favor of the amendment? Opposed? Amendment carries, and we're back to the main motion.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Chung.
Yes, I'd like to propose an amendment to the motion that the witnesses be given 5 minutes for their opening statements, that whenever possible, witnesses provide the committee with their opening statements 72 hours in advance.
Okay, members have heard the amendment. Any debate on the amendment? Mr. Harris.
Yes, sir. There was some discussion in other committees about this particular motion, that the 5 minutes is maybe very useful, particularly if you have 3 witnesses in a session or something like that. But that one of the chairs expressed the view that someone suggested discretion be used to perhaps increase it. And the chair was of the view that this particular motion didn't give the chair any discretion to provide a longer time. So there may be occasions when we only have 1 witness, for example, and so at the discretion of the chair was inserted before the 5 minutes or somewhere there, that the chair had the discretion in determining the length of the opening statement. It could be 5 to 7 minutes or some general discretion, so that and I think in one committee that we met with suggested that at the discretion of the chair in consultation with the parties. In fact, it was on the Canada-China committee, so it was on consultation with the vice chairs, of which I was one. But that sort of discretion, I think, ought to be included in the motion as well. And if someone has a specific amendment to include that, I wanted to raise that point.
Well, from the perspective of the chair, discretion would certainly be appreciated, but I'm not going to sway the debate. I will pass the word to Ms. Sahota, who's next on the list, please.
I was just going to ask maybe Mr. Chong if the wording, it seems like the wording may be for 72 hours where possible. Perhaps the 5 minute portion could also be made where possible, because there are going to be witnesses that are maybe talking about a very in-depth issue in this committee, perhaps one that we don't have that much background on. And maybe at times when we have 1 or 2 witnesses, we have that flexibility, or the chair has that discretion, just like mentioned before, to give them 10 minutes perhaps, but then, or 7 minutes, or 5 minutes when we have a larger panel, maybe where the complexity may be less depending on the issue. So if it could be, the language could be modified a little bit, giving you the discretion as chair where possible to only give them 5 to 7 minutes. That's fine.
Mr. Hoda, would you want to go as far as to propose amended language?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could just say that we give 5 minutes for opening statements when appropriate, or where possible. 5 to 7 minutes, we could even say 5 to 7 minutes for opening statements when appropriate, leaving discretion to the chair, and then have the rest of it remain the same.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hoda. We'll go to Mr. Genuis for comments on this.
Sure. Just for context, Mr. Chair, Mr. Harris referred to this. I thought I would just specifically mention what we did at the Canada-China Committee because I was pulling up the blues in the meantime. So at the Canada-China Committee, we adopted a motion for 5-minute opening statements. So we adopted this motion as is, and then we added at the end of the motion to say that, I'm sorry, I just lost where I was looking at here. To say that the chair would be authorized to adjust the amount of time for the opening statements in consultation with the vice chairs. So I think we might just say in consultation with the members of the subcommittee in this case. There's just a mechanism for that.
Okay. Thank you for that. I just may put a caveat in there. There may be instances where we keep things out of the subcommittee. I don't know if the committee's decided yet to go to the subcommittee on all matters. Sometimes we may decide it in plenary, so maybe something slightly more general, but it's the direction is certainly helpful. Mr. Chong and Ms. Sahota.
Yeah, I'd like to keep it to, look, I think we should keep it to a single numeral, I should say. We should keep it to a single numeral rather than 5 to 7 minutes. But I think we can capture what Ms. Sahota wants to do by simply beginning the sentence with that, comma, at the discretion of the chair, witnesses be given 5 minutes for their opening statements. That whenever possible, witnesses provide the committee with their opening statements 72 hours in advance. So it gives you as chair the flexibility after you informally consult with members of the committee about extending it beyond 5 minutes, but it makes it clear that the standard is 5 minutes. If there's an exceptional circumstance that warrants giving a witness a longer amount of time, Chair, I trust your judgment that you will consult widely and seek a consensus to use your discretion to elongate the time beyond 5 minutes. So I think if we begin it with that, that at the discretion of the chair, witnesses be given 5 minutes for their opening statements, that whenever possible, witnesses provide the committee with their opening statements 72 hours in advance, that captures what Madame Sahota wants to do and what we're trying to do here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong. So the conversation went from Ms. Sahota to Mr. Generous to Mr. Chong and back to Ms. Sahota. I have you on the list, and then Mr. Oliphant as well, and Mr. Harris. Ms. Sahota, please.
I was just going to say that I agree with Mr. Chong. I think that is a very good amendment that he's made. I think the wording is good, and I think we should go with that rather than having the vice chairs added in, because sometimes you really don't have enough time as chair between, depending on the study, you know, sometimes you're calling witnesses last minute or fitting them in last minute. You just might not have enough time to confer every little detail like that with the vice chairs. So I really like Mr. Chong's wording.
Okay, Mr. Oliphant, and then Mr. Harris.
I'm also fine with the wording with respect to discretion, and I can live with 5 minutes, but I actually think that it does a disservice to Canadians who want to appear before our committee. I have been on the other end of the table. I have been a witness appearing at parliamentary committees on important issues and take great time to prepare our statements. And I think sometimes it's important to remember it's not all about us. It's not all about our questions. So I do think 5 minutes can be extremely limiting to expert witnesses that we want to have their opening remarks. I think that is important. I can live with it, but I hope that the committee recognizes that this is about our witnesses too, and I hope that the chair will use that discretion.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. I have Mr. Harris and then Ms. Fry.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'd like to take the opportunity to echo what Mr. Oliphant is saying. 5 minutes is a short time for someone as loquacious as me, and our experts are dealing with far more complicated topics than we sometimes deal with in our short conversations. But I think perhaps the wording ought to be subject to the discretion of the chair instead of in the discretion of the chair, because the 5 minutes is it's not either 5 or nothing, it's 5 or more. So subject to the discretion of the chair, 5 or more minutes will be given to speak, would be allow that recognition that if we look at the timing of the first and second rounds, for example, depending whether we have one witness or two or three, if you have three, 5 minutes is as much as you can fit into a certain length of a meeting. But if there's only one witness, and so, often we have ministers speaking, obviously, for 10 minutes or more, and introductions. So I think there is a fair bit of discretion used in these meetings, and I think would be better to state it as not quite open-ended, but that it can be as low as 5 minutes, but it can be longer at the discretion of the chair, and perhaps subject to the discretion of chair, 5 minutes or more may be allocated to the speaker. That would give it some flexibility without mentioning more than one number.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Ms. Fry.
I just wanted, to agree with Rob Oliphant. I think the message that we want to give as a standing committee is that we really care about what experts have to tell us, and that the committees are really for Canadians to give us input and information. They're not really supposed to cater to the needs of the committee members. And I think giving that strong message that we really would like to see it, I would like to say 7 minutes, according to the discretion of chair. Some people won't use the 7 minutes, but I think it sounds generous when we say 7 minutes. It sounds like we really care. And I also like the discretion of the chair because nobody opposed this chair. And so everyone seems to have confidence in the chair. So let us show that we have confidence in the chair, and let's show our witnesses that we actually care about what they have to say.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fry. I see no further hands raised on this part of the debate. Is there any other comments that are waiting on this issue? If not, could I ask either Mr. Hoda or perhaps Madam Clerk just to reread the text of the amended motion?
I think Madam Clerk would be great to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what I have right now is that at the discretion of the chair, witnesses be given 5 or more minutes for their opening statement, that wherever possible, the witnesses provide their statement to the committee 72 hours in advance, that at the discretion of the chair during the first round of questioning of witnesses, there be allocated 6 minutes for the first questioner of each party as follows: Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Bloc Québécois, and New Democratic Party. And then in the second half, I have for the second and subsequent rounds, the order and time for the questioning be as follows: Conservative 5 minutes, Liberal 5 minutes, Bloc Québécois 2.5 minutes, New Democratic Party 2.5 minutes, and then back to the 5 minutes for the Conservative and Liberal parties.
Thank you so much. Of the amendment as read. Any opposed? Okay, the amendment carries, and we're back to the main motion. Any additional debates on the main motion as amended? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion as amended? Any opposed? Motion carries. Ms. DeBrusen, thank you.
D'accord. Alors, celui-là,
distribution of documents, that the clerk of the committee be authorized to distribute documents to members of the committee only when the documents are available in both official languages, and that witnesses be advised accordingly. Thank you. Debate on the motion?
Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Ms. DeBrusen.
Oh, I love this one, working meals. Maybe can get snacks delivered. Okay. That the clerk of the committee be authorized to make the necessary arrangements to provide working meals for the committee and its subcommittees.
Okay, members have heard the motion. Any debate on this motion, which was conceived pre-COVID, but will be relevant as we go into a hybrid setting? Any discussion, any thoughts, any debate on this? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Bruson.
D'accord. Frais de déplacement et de...
Travel, accommodation, and living expenses of witnesses that, if requested, reasonable travel, accommodation, and living expenses be reimbursed to witnesses, not exceeding 2 representatives per organization, provided that, in exceptional circumstances, payment for more representatives be made at the discretion of the chair. We've heard the motion. Any debate on the motion?
All opposed? Any opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Bruson.
Access to in-camera meetings, that unless otherwise ordered, each committee member be allowed to have 1 staff member at an in-camera meeting, and that 1 additional person from each House officer's office be allowed to be present.
Okay, members have heard the text of the motion. Is there debate on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion? Any opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Bruson.
Okay. Transcripts of in-camera meetings. That 1 copy of the transcript of each in-camera meeting be kept in the committee clerk's office for consultation by members of the committee or by their staff.
Okay, members have heard the text of this motion. Is there any debates on transcripts? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Ms. DeBrusen.
Notice of motion that a 48 hours notice interpreted as 2 nights shall be required for any substantive motion to be considered by the committee unless the substantive motion relates directly to business then under consideration, provided that 1, the notice be filed with the clerk of the committee no later than 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time from Monday to Friday, that 2, the motion be distributed to members in both official languages by the clerk on the same day the said notice was transmitted, if it was received no later than the deadline hour, and that 3, notices received after the deadline hour or on non-business days be deemed to have been received during the next business day, and that when the committee is traveling on official business, no substantive motions may be moved.
Thank you, Ms. DeBrusen. Members have heard the text of this slightly longer motion. Any debate on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Ms. DeBrusen.
Okay. Cadeau. Que le...
Gifts. That the committee be authorized to purchase gifts to be presented to foreign hosts and visiting delegations.
Any debate on gifts to debate? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Ms. DeBrusen.
So I'm just checking which language I'm in. I'm in English? Okay. This is a longer one. Orders of reference from the House respecting bills. That in relation to orders of reference from the House respecting bills, A, the clerk of the committee shall, upon the committee receiving such an order of reference, write to each member who is not a member of a caucus represented on the committee to invite those members to file with the clerk of the committee in both official languages any amendment to the bill, which is the subject of the said order, which they would suggest that the committee consider. B, suggested amendments filed pursuant to paragraph A at least 48 hours prior to the start of the clause-by-clause consideration of the bill to which the amendments relate shall be deemed to be proposed during the said consideration, provided that the committee may, by motion, vary this deadline in respect of a given bill. And C, during the clause-by-clause consideration of a bill, the chair shall allow a member who filed suggested amendments pursuant to paragraph A an opportunity to make brief representations in support of them.
Okay, merci, Madame DeBrusen. Les membres du comité ont entendu la motion. Est-ce que du...
Members of the committee have heard the motion. Any debate? Mr. Bergeron. Pardon me if I'm mistaken, but I don't recall having seen this motion before. Could you reread it a second time before we vote? Yes, I would imagine. Madame de Brussen?
D'accord, je vais le lire de nouveau, juste un instant.
I'll read it again. I'll read it again. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. Orders of reference from the House respecting bills. That, in relation to orders of reference from the House respecting bills, A, the clerk of the committee shall, upon the committee receiving such an order of reference, write to each member who is not a member of a caucus represented on the committee to invite those members to file with the clerk of the committee in both official languages any amendments to the bill, which is the subject of the said order, which they would suggest that the committee consider. B, suggested amendments filed pursuant to paragraph A at least 48 hours prior to the start of clause-by-clause consideration of the bill to which the amendments relate shall be deemed to be proposed during the said consideration, provided that the committee may, by motion, vary this deadline in respect of a given bill. And C, during the clause-by-clause consideration of a bill, the chair shall allow a member who suggested amendments pursuant to paragraph A an opportunity to make brief representation in support of them. Thank you very much. Is there any debate on the motion?
Benefits to...
Yes, for the benefit of Mr. Bergeron. This is a rule that was put forward by Mrs. May of the Green Party because 2 parliamentary sessions ago, Mrs. May presented 2,000 amendments for the budget at the House of Commons, and we voted on each and every amendment for 2 days. And it's because of that there was no committee rule that enabled the Green Party to present amendments to the committee. So that's why we have this rule for all committees now. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chung, for your clarification. Debate on the motion. Mr. Genuis?
Clarify, because the language that it used seemed to say a member of parliament who is a member of a caucus that is not part of this committee. Does this apply to independent members as well? Because maybe Madam Clerk, you can just clarify.
Yes, please, Madam Clerk. That's an important question. Independent members?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Technically, the Green Party are all sitting as independent members. You have to have a certain number of people per party to be a recognized party. So it does include all independent members.
Point of clarification, Mr. Chair.
Please.
Sorry to be hair splitting here, but the 3 members of the Green Party are sitting as members of parties in the House of Commons, but not members of recognized parties in the House of Commons. And that's the fine distinction. So they are sitting as party members, but not as recognized party members.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chung. Yeah, with respect to independence, I think they're captured by the fact that it's a member who's not a member of a caucus represented on the committee. So we're inclusive in that sense that it applies to all independents. That's a point worth noting for the committee. Is there any other debates, any other questions, clarifications required before we vote on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor of this motion? Any opposed? Motion carries. Madame de Brussen?
I have one last one. In-camera meetings. that the committee may meet in camera only for the following purposes. A, to consider a draft report. B, to attend briefings concerning national security. C, to consider lists of witnesses. D, for any other reason with unanimous consent of the committee. That all votes taken in camera, with the exception of votes regarding the consideration of draft reports, be recorded in the minutes of proceeding, including how each member voted when recorded votes are requested. That any motion to sit in camera is debatable and amendable.
Okay, members have heard the text of this motion. Is there debate on the motion? I have Mr. Harris.
Yes, I would raise whether the tradition has been that the subcommittee on agenda and procedures discusses more than witnesses and lists of witnesses, but that their deliberations are in camera, and they often talk about what studies shall be done, in what order, and all of those things. These are matters that are normally in camera. I don't think, and I haven't seen this motion, and I'm a little bit uncomfortable dealing with complex motions without having the wording in front of us. We did have the routine motions because they've been circulated, but I haven't seen this motion, and I don't know whether the chair is able to assure me that that included in the list of what in camera meetings is included the subcommittee on agenda and procedure.
That's an important point. Mr. Harris, thank you. Let me ask our clerk for not only clarification of that point, but also perhaps her views on the tenor of this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a new motion to me. I have just received the wording of it, so I can circulate it to the members of the committee if you give me 2 minutes. In terms of the motion itself, there are some issues in particular with this committee that I would flag to the members. So for example, Foreign Affairs and International Development could deal with situations that have diplomatic repercussions. So for example, if you are trying to study a situation in country X versus a situation in country Y, that would be recorded. So people would know that you made a decision of one country over another or one situation over another. If that happened in camera, your recorded division would be included, but the proceedings of everything would be in camera. So you would not be able to discuss your reasoning behind making those decisions without violating privilege. So that one major diplomatic consideration might be something that I would flag to the committee members.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk, for that clarification. Are there views by members on this motion? Any debates? I have Mr. Harris and Mr. Oliphant.
Yes, I'm not, I don't think that the committee should decide this today. We haven't had time to review it and think about it. I don't know where it's coming from or what the purpose of it is overall. I would, can I move that this be tabled? Or I think Mr. Oliphant's favorite motion that we adjourn debate on this particular motion.
Well, Mr. Harris, with your indulgence, let's have Mr. Oliphant come in on his views, and I think that may be a direction that members are exploring. Mr. Oliphant.
Sorry, point of order, Mr. Chair. Just my understanding is that a motion to adjourn the debate is not debatable. Am I correct in that, or
it isn't? But I don't know if it was put in those terms.
Mr. Harris, did you move a motion to adjourn the debate, or?
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm preempting Mr. Oliphant from making the same motion. I'd prefer to have the motion dealt with. But I don't mind him having his views.
I think that Mr. Harris and I are on the same page here. And my own side may be upset with me. I would like time to think about this. We've been in many situations where in the middle of a meeting, we recognize that we're getting a testimony perhaps from a vulnerable person with respect to a human rights issue. I've had meetings where I've had LGBTQ witnesses from another country that wanted their identities protected. We didn't know that in the meeting. There's several situations. We've had some Yazidi members of community that wanted their protected, but we weren't prepared for that. Just several issues. I would like a little bit of time to think about that. So if either Mr. Harris or I can move a motion to adjourn debate on this so that we could bring it back and think about it, I'd just like a little bit of time with it. And I probably upset someone on my own team about that.
I have a sense that a motion to adjourn debate is imminent, but it hasn't been brought yet.
I move it.
Okay, Mr. Harris has moved that debate now be adjourned on this motion. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Chung.
Yes, I'd like to move some additional routine motions that were adopted in the first session of the 43rd Parliament in this committee. The first routine motion I would like to move is that all meetings other than those deemed in camera be televised or webcast where possible.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor that members have heard. Is there debate on Mr. Chung's motion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion? Any opposed? Motion carries.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Chung?
Yeah, I'd like to move another motion concerning routine motions. C'est une motion de...
It is a motion with regard to a subcommittee on international human rights that, given section 108(1) and 2, that we create a subcommittee on international human rights chaired by an elected member by the subcommittee to look at issues linked to the promotion of respect for international human rights as requested by the committee, that the subcommittee be chaired by a member of the government party and be comprised of 8 members or 8 associated members, including 4 from the government party, 2 from the Conservative Party, 1 from the Bloc Québécois, and 1 from the NDP, named after the consultations with WHIP.
Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development be granted the authority to print from day to day such papers and evidence as may be ordered by them pursuant to Standing Order 108(1)A. That the committee be empowered to send for persons, papers, and records, to receive evidence, to sit during a time when the committee is not sitting in Ottawa, to sit when the committee is sitting outside the parliamentary precinct, and to sit during periods when the House stands adjourned, and that the chair of the subcommittee meet with the subcommittee on agenda and procedure of the committee at their mutual discretion. Mr. Chair, this is exactly the same motion that was adopted in the first session of the 43rd Parliament.
Mr. Chung, thank you for bringing the motion and thank you for clarifying that point, because that would have been my question to the clerk, but you've preempted that. Thank you very much. Debate on this motion. I have Ms. Sahota.
No debate. I just wanted the clerk to confirm that because it is lengthy, that it's identical to the previous version.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Any other points, debate, questions, clarification on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Chung. And that takes us through routine motions. Colleagues, I'm wondering if anybody would like to raise, yes, Mr. Harris?
I don't have it in front of me, but there was a motion with respect to media as well that I don't think we heard today. I didn't come prepared with a list of potential routine motions, but I would assume that that is a similar idea that we ought to consider. I don't have it right in front of me, but maybe the clerk would have access to that motion.
Let's briefly verify, Madam Clerk. Is that something that you have at your fingertips? If not, we can circle back, and if somebody would like to introduce that motion in its text as it's written, that's something we will contemplate. Mr. Harris, you're not moving it right now. I understand
No,
because
I don't.
you don't have the text.
I don't have the text in front of
Okay.
me, so I can't do that.
Okay. Let me go then to Ms. Sahota, please, who's next on the list.
Thank you. I'm raising and lowering my hand quite quickly, but thanks for noticing that. I thought you would have had it up from last time, but I wanted to move, since we're through the routine motions, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to ask whether this would be the appropriate time for me to move my motion for a proposed study. It's one that was brought up in the last session as well. Is that okay with you?
Please, Ms. Sahota, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I have circulated this motion in English and French since I am moving it from the floor. Just wanted to make sure everyone had it. And I want to thank the clerk for also pointing out an addition I was able to make to it, so that some feedback that the NDP and the bloc had in the previous session is also incorporated into this motion. And I'll just read it out loud at this point. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study on challenges facing populations living in fragile contexts, including an examination of issues such as education of refugees and displaced children, gender equality.
Ms. Sahota, with your indulgence, I'm getting a message that translation or interpretation is not able to hear you. I'm wondering, is there any way you can bring the microphone up closer, or just try again with slightly greater clarity, and hopefully that will allow interpreters to do their work.
Yes, absolutely. I will try to go slower as well, because I need help with IT on my other device, so I won't be able to switch over to it. I'll start again so that it can be interpreted appropriately. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study on challenges facing populations living in fragile contexts, including an examination of issues such as education of refugees and displaced children, gender equality in fragile contexts, children on the move, children in conflict, child protection, children and peace building, and other related issues, including the effects of COVID-19, resource scarcity, health and nutrition, examining such cases and conflicts as Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, Venezuela, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan. That the concept note prepared by the Library of Parliament in the first session of the 43rd Parliament serve as the scope for this study, and that the committee report its findings back to the House.
Ms. Sahota, thank you very much. I understand there may still be problems with the interpretation. I understand that you circulated the motion in both official languages to the clerk, so maybe that will help us bridge the gap. Est-ce qu'il y avait des problèmes avec l'interprétation pour ceux qui...
Was there any problems with interpretation services?
Members able to hear and understand the text of the motion? Yes? Monsieur Bergeron?
On m'indique
Yes, indeed, there were interpretation problems. It seems for people listening remotely. But were you able to hear the text? Well, I was listening to the original. Okay.
On what needs to be done to make sure that everybody heard this properly, but within the group of members that we have here, my understanding is that the members were able to hear the motion. I have a list of interventions, debate on this motion. Monsieur Bergeron, puis Mr. Chung.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just bring the motion up and I can read it in French.
Okay, if that would be helpful, definitely.
Okay, je suis prête.
So I am ready. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Standing Committee undertake a study on challenges facing children living in fragile contexts, including an examination of issues such as education of refugee and displaced children, gender equality in fragile contexts, children on the move, children in conflict, child protection, children and peace building, and other related issues including health, examining such cases and conflicts, and other related issues including health and nutrition, examining such cases and conflicts as Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, Venezuela, Ethiopia, and Afghanistan, and report and that the note prepared by the library in the last Parliament be used for this study, and that the committee report its findings back to the House. Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. There are 4 colleagues wanting to speak on this issue, Mr. Bergeron and Mr. Chong first. Mr. Bergeron. First, Mr. Chair, a general comment. We did indeed agree to undertake this study on top of another shorter study coming from the past Parliament on democracy. But the pandemic happened, and during the pandemic, the chair at the time, Mr. Levitt, communicated with vice chairs quite regularly on an informal basis, and I believe that everyone agreed that perhaps the themes we had chosen to be looked at by this committee were not as relevant given the pandemic, that with the warnings given by the World Health Organization, the WHO said that other pandemics could happen. And we thought that we would have an opportunity to meet again and to discuss this. We had agreed at the time to look at the coordination of the international community and see how this could help us perhaps contain the pandemic and help us prevent the ones that the WHO has already warned humanity about. So in this regard, I had prepared a motion. Would you like me to table it at this time, Mr. Chair? I sent it to all committee members and to the clerk a few minutes ago in both official languages. I will read it, Mr. Chair, and perhaps you can tell me what you want us to do with it. So, following the informal discussions we had regarding the studies we had decided to carry out that may not have been as relevant given the pandemic, I would submit that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study on the mobilization and coordination of the international community, including action taken internationally by the Canadian government to contain this pandemic and to prevent ones that the WHO has already warned humanity about. So, of course, you will understand, Mr. Speaker, that because I was in agreement with the decision that had been taken at the time to undertake a study on vulnerable populations, I do not object here to the idea that we resume our work or that we start our work on this very issue. But I fear that if we were to go forward with such a theme, some might say that this is not in line with the concerns of the international community, which have to do with the current pandemic and the prevention of future pandemics, given the experience we are having and that we are still experiencing. So, in order to remain relevant here with current events, with regard to current events and concerns that are ongoing. I was wondering if perhaps it would be more relevant to heed the discussions we have had at the time with the chair and the vice chairs during the lockdown, when we agreed to perhaps look at the ways we could mobilize the international community to contain this pandemic and to prevent future pandemics. And this is the reason why I have circulated this proposal, this motion. So I will leave it to you, Mr. Chair, to decide. And I would repeat that I am in agreement in principle with the motion that was tabled by our colleague. Maybe there would be some tweaks to do in the French version. I would replace fragile by vulnerable in the French version, for example. And in the list of countries, I would include the word including. But in the light of what has happened and following the discussions we have had, I was wondering if it would still be relevant to undertake that study given what humanity is facing now and has been faced with in the last few months. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron, pour cette intervention très importante. Turning our mind to the relevance.
Thank you for this intervention.
And adapt our studies accordingly and recognizing that there may well be overlaps and a lot of fluidity in terms of the subjects that we're each thinking about that we're bringing forward to this committee or that you are bringing forward. So your point is very well taken. I see Ms. Sahoda has put herself back in the queue. I think she would want to respond to your comments, and I'm assuming in a very constructive way. But before we go to her, I have Mr. Chong, Mr. Genuis, Mr. Harris, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are a number of competing ideas coming from members of this committee about what we should study. We have the motion on the floor from Madame Sahoda. We just got a notice from Monsieur Bergeron about what he'd like to study. I'm going to suggest a path forward for the committee, and hopefully we can get a consensus on that. I think what we should do is defer all these potential studies to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure so that the group of 5 of us, including you, Mr. Chair, can hash out what this committee is going to study in the coming months, as opposed to dealing with it right now. The other thing I'd like to put on the table is I would like us, before this meeting adjourns today, after we've disposed of this motion from Madame Sahoda, I would like us to call the 2 ministers responsible for the estimates in front of our committee. As you know, Parliament has not sat regularly since mid-March, and I believe it a fundamental responsibility of parliamentary committees to review the estimates. We have estimates that are in front of this committee. The period of supply, I understand, finishes on November 27th, when they will be deemed automatically reported back to the House. And so I think we should call separately both the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of International Development to explain the estimates that they have requested of Parliament. So I know we're not going to deal with that right now because we're on Madame Sahoda's motion, but before we adjourn today, I'd like to at least see if there's a consensus among the committee to proceed and at least give the clerk something to work on when the committee adjourns today. But to that end, I'd like to move an amendment to this motion in order to get some clarity here about what I'm proposing. So the amendment I would like to move is the following: that the committee, and this amendment, by the way, before I read it out, would be in front of the motion that Madame Sahoda has just presented. So it's an amendment that we would put in front of her motion. And the amendment would read that the committee have a discussion of the study below and any other future committee business, deferring any decision to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure, that motions for consideration of future business by the subcommittee be submitted to the clerk no later than end of business day, Thursday, October 15th, that the subcommittee on agenda and procedure meet this Friday, October 16th, to discuss future committee business, and that the subcommittee on agenda and procedure report back to the committee next week.
Mr. Chair, a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
So I will begin by saying I'm completely in agreement with the intent of Mr. Chong's amendment to Mr. Hoda's motion. However, I don't believe it's an amendment. I think it is a completely different kettle of fish, which I would like you to rule on in a moment. That being said, I think we could work our way out of this quite easily by both Mr. Bergeron and Madame Sahota's suggestions for work being withdrawn for the moment, and to consider this as a motion that Mr. Chong is bringing forward. I think it's actually quite good. It may actually be two motions, in my humble opinion. It may be a motion to invite each of our two ministers to appear before us for estimates, which I believe the government side would be completely in favor of. So just to put that out there. And then I think a motion with a deadline for everyone get their motions in on potential studies, have them go to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure, and then have that committee report back. Always a little nervous about us telling the chair when to set a meeting, but we could advise the chair that a meeting on Friday would be useful, knowing that it is not the call of the chair that those meetings happen, but that the spirit of this, I think, would move our committee along. It would allow us to take Mr. Bergeron's important issue, Ms. Sahota's important issue, and other important issues that anybody else could raise, put them into a hopper, and then we could, the subcommittee could come back with a good initial work plan for approval by this whole committee, not wanting to stop discussion, but wanting to kind of stop discussion.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Chong is smiling.
Thank you very much. And I've got Mr. Genuis, Mr. Harris, and Ms. Hoda on the list, but just to sort of zoom in on that, to untangle this not quite cascade of motions yet, procedurally, Madam Clerk, would we be best off if Ms. Sahota were to withdraw her motion in favor of the suggestion of Mr. Oliphant and Mr. Chong? Or can we get there in a more expeditious way to achieve what I think is really emerging as a common view? But before we answer that definitively, I do want to hear from Mr. Genuis and Mr. Harris as well, and Ms. Sahota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Currently, the motion of Ms. Sahota is before the committee. If she wishes to withdraw it, then it would take the unanimous consent of the committee to withdraw that and move to the consideration of deferring things to the subcommittee or to Monsieur Bergeron's motion, however you choose to proceed.
Okay, and that I was hoping to sort of get to the question of whether Mr. Chong's amendment is in fact an amendment. If I have to rule on that, I certainly will. But let me go to Mr. Genuis and Mr. Harris, and then Ms. Sahota, and then hopefully we'll have a fulsome set of views on the table of what to do next.
Well, I'll be brief then, because I'm in agreement with the Chong Oliphant plan. But I wanted to just sort of make a general comment, and I mean this as sort of a suggestion from me to the subcommittee. I agree that the subcommittee should discuss these matters, but I think recognizing that we're in a minority parliament, the dissolution of which could come at any time as a result of decisions that are going to be made above our heads, I think we need to look for bite-sized chunks of work that we can accomplish. And the motion that we're officially still debating, it looks at people in fragile contexts, and it gives examples from 3 continents. It's just, from my perspective, so broad that it's the kind of mega study that we risk not completing before events overtake us. And I mean, I've learned this from experienced members of parliament that, I mean, there's some cases of committees that have tried to study issues that are so broad in scope that they end up coming back to them in parliament after parliament after parliament. And that's true in general, particularly true in the case of minorities. So one suggestion that I wanted to put for the subcommittee's consideration, but would be that we look at a specific issue of vulnerability. And I wanted to suggest that we should look at the issue of Canadian children who are stuck in Kurdish-controlled camps in northern Syria, which is a very specific case of vulnerability that I think we could identify other specific cases of vulnerability, but if we look at specific issues rather than the general issue of people having challenges in places, that we can come up with more targeted recommendations and more actionable results for the government. But I put that forward merely as a suggestion for discussion at the subcommittee, and I'm supportive of moving forward with the plan that Mr. Chong and Mr. Oliphant have put forward.
Thank you, Mr. Generous. Mr. Harris, please.
Well, first of all, I got on the list to start with to suggest an amendment to Mr. Hoda's motion because she was talking about, a very general motion, as Mr. Generous has pointed out, that the left out of the list here was one that I was moved to add to the list, and that Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, Venezuela, Ethiopia, Afghanistan. I would add Palestine to that, a situation where there's very vulnerable children who are now in a situation where the country, the state has no funds to operate with, and their vulnerability is increasing. So I don't think that they could be left out of any list in dealing with displaced and vulnerable refugee children. And as they exist in Palestine or Palestinian refugees elsewhere. So I would want to include that as amended to the motion. But I think Mr. Bergeron has given rise to, and Mr. Chong and Oliphant, my own thoughts as well, and I've discussed it with some members of the committee before. This committee back in March granted just before the House closed on the 12th of March, actually adopted a resolution coming out of a series of proposed studies, none of which has been done, obviously. Some of which may have changed their focus as a result of Mr. Bergeron's what Mr. Bergeron has to say, and the role that Canada might play in the current pandemic crisis, particularly as it may be able to assist countries that need help, may be a priority. But the idea of priorities is not going to be resolved by people here today coming up with 4 or 5 or 6 different motions. We do have a plethora of motions that were available. Some of those can be repeated easily, Mr. Chair, as I'm sure you know, between now and Thursday, and available for our erstwhile committee on Friday, if that's the will of the committee to study. That makes perfect sense. Mr. Chong's motion or suggested motion of having both ministers come, and I would say yes, both the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who's been before the committee before on supplementary estimates, but the Minister of International Development should be here on the estimates, but perhaps also on her mandate letter, which will give some broader consideration for questioning by members of the committee at 2 separate meetings. These could be done early, in the sense of fairly early, without a lot of preparation by the analysts, and time would be then available to whatever study is given priority to be able to call or arrange for witnesses or enact that process to get going. So I think that's a very good approach. On whether the fact that Ms. Hoda's motion may be the first one considered either by this committee or otherwise doesn't mean that, of course, it's going to be the top priority of the committee. That's the will of the committee ultimately, when I think wisely it should be given to the subcommittee to consider what we've had on our plate already, and which was passed. It was adopted by the committee, which fine, it doesn't exist, but the work was done, the thought was given to it. There were a lot of considerations given at that meeting by all members of the subcommittee. and by the full committee when it adopted on March the 12th the motion that it did. So I don't think we should throw that work away, but we should also obviously modify it in accordance with the fact that for the last 7 months, we've been dealing with the extremely difficult coronavirus circumstances worldwide, and clearly that has to be to change our views. But the other studies will be equally interesting for us to give priority to, perhaps modify, and whatever other new ideas might come up between now and Thursday. So I'm of the view that we should either dispose of Ms. Sabota's motion or refer it to the committee as amended or not, and deal with it that way. Procedurally, at least, we could refer that to the committee if someone wants to move that. Then and get it that way without Ms. Hoda having to withdraw it. I mean, she may want to withdraw it and submit it to the committee. That's up to her. Those are my views, sir.
Mr. Harris, thank you very much for that fulsome commentary. My unanswered question so far is whether Mr. Chong's amendment constitutes an amendment. I'm mindful of that. I have the committee's collective view in front of me that there be a subcommittee meeting. I will certainly make myself available, and if Friday works for the members of the subcommittee, then it'll absolutely happen on Friday. And also, I think a shared view that we will invite the two ministers separately for estimates. I would like to go back to Ms. Sahota, who is still on the speaker's list. Please.
Thank you. I will start with, first of all, saying I appreciate all of my colleagues' interventions. First, Mr. Bergeron, I agree that that the word vulnerability could be replaced in terms of wherever we've got fragile. So that's not a problem. Also, the countries that are listed, I believe he recommended including but not limited to, so we're not limited to those countries. I'm not sure if I agree with the extremely narrow focus that Mr. Genis has provided, but I do agree that Mr. Chong's amendments, not really sure if those are amendments. I think we would be moving to a motion that he could propose after we dispose of my motion. I'm just trying to make up my mind as to whether I'd withdraw this. And I guess I need to hear from Mr. Bergeron if he's in agreement, because I don't know if his motion takes, I guess if I withdraw my motion, then there's no longer an amendment, and then would we be moving to Mr. Bergeron's motion, which he read into the record just a little while ago, or would we not be moving to that, or would he be also willing to withdraw and send it to the subcommittee? So I need clarification on that before I can really make up a decision. And I also wanted to say that it seems through this process, we will all be sending lots of different notices of motions to the subcommittee. I also wanted to clarify that anything that gets decided at the subcommittee is not really a final decision. It would then come back to the whole committee to then dispose of, vote on, and make the final decision. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Hota, thank you very much. And that's right. I think we're going into a constructive direction here. The one thing I should say is that with respect to Friday, I may have been a bit hasty to say, well, I'm certainly available, but the meeting is contingent upon resources and the decision of the whips. So I don't want to hold out that there will be a Friday meeting. If it can happen, I think it would be great to have it earlier than later, but it may have to be moved because of logistical constraints. And I would like to pass the word back to Monsieur Bergeron just to clarify if it was in fact a motion. I think he was getting into the text of a motion, but may not have moved it as such, just so that we can, in the next 10 minutes or so, or less than that, that we can tackle the question of what to do with Madame Sahota's motion. Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Chair, I had in fact read my motion, but that being said, if Ms. Sahota withdraws her motion, and we refer it to the subcommittee, which may take place this week, I could do the same thing with my motion. I think, yes, if we want to have a constructive debate and get results, in the time that remains to us, I think it would be make more sense to refer everything to the subcommittee, and we have a proposal that'll come back to the whole committee. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Madame Sahota?
With your motion.
Yeah, at this time, I think all I'd like to say is even I recognize that my motion is something that the analysts had helped work on with the Library of Parliament previously too, and something that it seems that all members were interested in at that point. And I did try to incorporate the context of COVID-19 within that. I do still strongly feel that it is a current issue, just as it was prior to 7 months ago. I understand that we're currently in a pandemic, but I do think that these vulnerable populations should be looked at by this committee within the context of COVID-19, because I think this pandemic makes it all that much harder for these populations, and we should be looking at solutions and reporting on those. So I would, at this point, seeing as how Mr. Bergeron is also agreeing to withdraw his motion, I will withdraw my motion and slightly tweak it and present it to the subcommittee in time for whatever date is decided, because I don't think what was moved by or what was called framed as an amendment by Mr. Chong at this point is not really on the table, I think. So I think we should move to discussion, hopefully, as to where when the deadline would be for all of the members to submit their proposals. So I will withdraw. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Sahota. And maybe I could ask the clerk in terms of, on the assumption that we may be able to pull off a Friday meeting of the subcommittee, deadline by Thursday would be reasonable, Thursday morning, earlier, later? What would be your advice in terms of when to put material in?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If it is going to be Thursday, then I would ask that everything be sent to me in both official languages, because I may not have time to coordinate the translation on that as well.
Okay. Any views from members on this turnaround? On anything else that should be raised with the subcommittee as we're planning its first session?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, please, Mr.
Chung. In addition to what the clerk has suggested, I also suggest that we report back to this committee the results of the subcommittee's deliberations next week.
Okay. Again, that's contingent upon, I'm very optimistic that we will be able to do that under the time frame that we're facing, but we may face constraints from the perspective of resources and decisions of our whips, but point taken. Any other views to close out this portion of the discussion? Okay. Well, look, this leaves us 4 minutes. I think we've had a very fulsome exchange.
Could I just clarify? And I might have missed this. Did we actually pass a motion inviting the two ministers to come? No. Because I do think that would be something that would be good to get done today, yep. So that, because it takes a while to get ministers scheduled, and it also gives the clerk and the analyst some work to do because the agenda committee may not be able to meet this Friday because of scheduling, as you said, it would allow us. So I would, if Mr. Chong would make that motion as not an amendment this time, I think that we could get that piece of work done and get going on it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Chong, please.
Mr. Chair, I move that the Minister of Foreign Affairs be invited to the committee to discuss the main estimates for 2 hours, and that the Minister of International Development be invited separately to the committee to discuss the main estimates for 2 hours.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor, straightforward. All members were able to hear it. Debate on this motion. Mr. Harris.
I wonder if I could move that to add to the main estimates with respect to the International Development Minister and her mandate letter.
Okay, so that's an amendment to the motion that Mr. Chong made. Any discussion on that amendment? Mr. Oliphant?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Ms. Sahota.
I I just, could Mr. Harris repeat that? I just need clarification. I think I just didn't hear it clearly.
I'd be very happy to, Chair.
Please go ahead, Mr. Harris.
Yes, to add to the consideration by the Minister of International Development, the words and her mandate letter. The reason I add that is because we did the same for Minister Champagne back in March, and it gives a little bit more scope for questions sometimes. And I don't know whether this chair would be as picky as some chairs. Some are very strict on these issues. Some look for a line item in the budget whenever you ask a question, and you have to play legal games to contort yourself into the right question. If we have that opportunity with respect to Madam Gould, then by adding the mandate letter, I think gives more scope and allows for a freer flow of discussion and question.
Okay. Any further discussion on Mr. Harris's amendment? Seeing none, all in favor of the amendment? Any opposed? Okay, the amendment carries. Returning to the original motion, Mr. Chung, if you could just briefly restate the motion as amended.
That the committee have a general discussion, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs be invited to the committee to discuss the main estimates for 2 hours, and that the Minister of International Development be invited separately to the committee to discuss the main estimates and her mandate letter for 2 hours.
Okay, any discussion on the main motion as amended? Seeing none, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant, for taking that piece of work out of our way and onto the agenda. And that leaves us with an exploration of the closest possible timing for a meeting of the subcommittee on procedure, the steering committee. And please, we will revert very shortly with the timeline for your motions, ideally in both official languages. And we will also revert with the timing of that subcommittee meeting. Madam Clerk, does that meet your requirements for the moment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Our analysts, our interpreters, our technicians behind the scenes, all of you and our staff who are working so hard to keep us strong. Thank you for being part of this committee. Thank you again for the confidence that you've placed in me. Challenging times, no doubt, but some important and interesting work ahead of us. I look forward to working with all of you, and we will be in touch very shortly with respect to the subcommittee meeting. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Monsieur Bergeron.
Tous ceux qui sont en faveur de l'adjournement, adopté. Merci beaucoup.
Au revoir.
Thank you, everyone. Au revoir.